Welcome. Let's get started. Happy Tuesday. Belated happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Valentine's Day when you're 46 doesn't really do much for you anymore. But I got to say, the best part about Valentine's Day for me, though, was picking up my preschooler because they did a Valentine's Day thing, and that's just the best. Kids are tough in a lot of ways, but they're the best in the way that they just see everything with a fresh view. So today we're going to talk about resources and a fun bet and ecologists and economists, also known as gadflies. That's one of my favorite words of recent use. An announcement here, Lab 4, the RStudio file is fine. The B courses file is, the word I wanted to find was decremented, I think. No, I think that's the wrong one still. My brain can't, deprecated, that's exactly right, it's deprecated. Leslie got me on the right track there. Some days your brain just can't find that word, and I'm having one of those days, so I hope that starts and ends with the word deprecated. So the B courses file is deprecated. Please download it again if you use it. So there was a typo in the B courses file. Any questions about that with Lab 4? And Lab 4 is due on Friday. Lab 4 is due on Friday. Questions? Well, today I hope we'll have some fun. It's interesting to see the broad sweep of this class over the 20 years that I've known this class. I think now, and of course, I don't really know. It's hard to guess this, but I think the climate and sustainability of population. It's really more the climate is kind of back in everybody's consciousness. I think. Back 20 years ago, I'm not really sure that it was, even though there were still the stirrings at that time of policies that could help us get our heads around what to do. So maybe this is more meaningful to you, maybe not, I don't know. It certainly was a really big deal back in the 1970s especially, for a variety of reasons. There are a lot of things happening there. But the classic bet between Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon, we'll talk about that. And that's after I wanted to bring us back to some of the basics and some things that are a little bit maybe more subtle than perhaps you have seen in your earlier econ courses about prices and productivity. And then we'll look at this. So David Lamb's very nice article who mentions the word gadfly at least once. I love that word. I think a slide about risk aversion. Then if we have time, we'll look at sustainability and a harvest model variant of the Malthusian model, which we'll get back to more next time. So let me start by saying about prices that, in general, there's really no rule that says prices always rise, always fall, or otherwise. Now, there are exceptions to that, and so, one of the big questions here this time, and just in general that you might wonder about it, well, what is the story with commodity prices, things like copper or tin or tungsten, or you could think about, I think pork bellies is one of my favorites. Apparently pork bellies is sort of an internationally traded thing because people like bacon, it turns out, and so pork bellies are traded on world markets, and the futures market for pork bellies is actually rather thick, it turns out. What we can say is that central banks, and you learned this in macro, tend to aim for average prices, usually excluding the volatile food and energy. And so right there, food is usually considered a commodity, or at least, well, some parts of it are. So aside from food and energy, usually the story there is the Federal Reserve aims for something like 2% growth in prices per year. But more generally, prices reflect supply and demand, and there can be shocks to both along the path to eternity. So in the very short run, prices can do any old crazy thing. In the medium term, they can still do any old crazy thing. And in the long run, there might be some general trend, maybe, for some of the prices that we're thinking about. It kind of depends what you're talking about and what the market conditions are. But what I want to emphasize, and maybe this isn't really all that novel to people of your generation now, that prices can change. They don't always have to rise. They can also go down. When I wrote the slide deck, that's what I thought was important to say based on my experience teaching over the last 20 years. But then it occurred to me that, these days, these little devices do so much for us. And I think a very clear way that probably many of you have already seen is that the price of an Uber changes with respect to the demand conditions. So if you've taken an Uber and you've checked it at different times, and then you're like, oh, that's too much money, I'm going to go check what? Lyft, right? That's the other thing you check. maybe we're still a little early for that if many of you are living within walking distance to campus and don't go to the city or something. But we're in a world where prices and quantities and supply to market is kind of in this brand new era of lightning fast, instant reflex, assistance with technology where previous generations of people just never really saw this. So when I told this story teaching at Queens College, this was really remarkable to most of the students there, and I'll tell you why in a second. So I was teaching during this period, and I was teaching macroeconomics at the time that the Great Recession hit, which was really, it was really something, let me tell you. It has not been that exciting to teach macroeconomics since then, but then it was really exciting. And my partner and I were living in the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn, which, if you're familiar with New York, is a fairly inner suburb. The equivalent might be something like Emeryville or downtown Oakland and its proximity to San Francisco with BART, something like that. And we had a one-bedroom apartment near quick transit to Manhattan. And so we were paying $21.70 per month, but by July 2009, so this is about a year and a half after the official start of the recession. Of course, one of the things at the time was nobody really knew we were in a recession. The thing gets dated much later. We all had this sense of dread, and there's more to be said about that. But, so that's a reduction of 15% in our rent. So part of this is boasting that this actually happened to us. But part of it is this actually can happen. And I guess before I talk about the background, let me go ahead and do an iClicker question. Why do you think this happened? So I think everybody has had their clicks registered. If you're having problems with it, here's the trick. Press the hold your power button down for 2 seconds, then press A, and that should get you to the finish line. So let's open up polling, and polling is open. Was it A? My landlord was really nice. Landlords are always so nice, aren't they? They're such understanding people. Maybe there was a big increase in the supply of one-bedroom apartments that might have pushed rents down. Rent is the price of housing. There was a big decrease in the demand for one-bedroom apartments. That's another thing that might have pushed down the price of housing. Maybe a technological breakthrough created a brand new substitute for apartments. Maybe none of these. What do you think? Okay, so let me close polling in 3, 2, 1. Well, when we moved into Berkeley, and it turns out that A actually was true for us living in Berkeley. We had the most fantastic landlords. The answer is C, and that's what most people said. There are some who said E. Everybody recognizes that D is completely ridiculous. There's no technological breakthrough that we're aware of that could actually substitute for apartments. As far as I know, I mean, right? That's a little bit not so true. I mean, these days you'll hear about sort of micro units that look like trailers, basically, that you could, I guess, in principle, put in somebody's backyard. But the problem is that the zoning ordinances typically preclude you from doing that sort of thing. There are other countries in the world where folks are a little bit better about these sort of high-density living arrangements and doing it quickly, but that was not the case here anyway. And it was not the case that there was a big increase in supply of one-bedroom apartments. New York, like the Bay Area, is sort of fixed in that regard. So it was a story about the decrease in the demand. So a big drop in the demand for one-bedroom apartments. And so why did this work for us? Well, the other part of the story that I didn't mention was that we didn't have a rent-stabilized or rent-controlled apartment. And the big story is in New York City usually is that many people do have rent-stabilized or rent-controlled apartments. If you're in student housing, and probably only about a quarter of you guys are, I don't think there's many. Who's in student housing here formally? Not many, because you're all upper-class people. And so there is rent control in Berkeley, I think, still. Oh, yeah. Okay, Leslie's nodding. Yes, there is. Yeah, that's why we have not moved, says Leslie. She's smart. I mean, that's the thing about that. And so that's also, and it's more true about New York City, that there is broader rent control and broader, if you like, lock-in. People don't move away. They figure out some clever way of passing the lease to somebody else. And so if you're ever in the mood, there's a whole seamy underbelly of stories like that for what's often called key money, which was with these massive bribes that people would pay to each other in New York City for the privilege of getting a key to this apartment that was rent controlled. And it was, if you remember Nora Ephron, who actually died several years ago, but she was the author of books that became some of those Meg Ryan movies like When Harry Met Sally, I think was Nora Ephron. So she had this big tell-all about that and what people did. And it was, actually very wealthy people in Manhattan, but they used the black market, so they're able to pay these ridiculous bribes, basically, to other people to move into their rent-controlled apartments. Okay, a very long-winded way of saying that in New York, nobody believed me when I said prices fall. It's because everybody's below market rate on rent. In New York City, everybody is below market rate on rent. Certainly, the groups of folks who were students at Queens College who were not yet rich, some of them later I think were, prices fall. So what's another reason why prices might change? And so let's talk about this. And so here's another iClicker question, if you please. Suppose a substitute for a good X were developed and brought to market. What might this mean for the price of X? Okay, so let's close polling in 3, 2, 1. Okay, and so the best answer here is the price of X would fall if a substitute for X is brought to market. So A is the best answer. Okay, folks broadly got that. That's fantastic. So what's a good substitute? It obviously depends on the thing, doesn't it? We'll have a little bit more to say formally about what does a substitute look like in the graphs that we like to use in microeconomics, and so that's coming up in a bit, but I just want to get us started on that, thinking about substitutes, and of course the other side of that would be complements, substitutes and complements. So a good example of a complement, sorry, let's click back here, there we go. A great example of a substitute, rather, I just said a little while ago. So who has taken Uber before? A bunch of you have. Okay, yeah, good. So you're students, but you're not living in the dorms, so you do have to get places in Berkeley, and so you may take Uber if you're late for an exam or something. And so the obvious example here, right? A substitute for Uber is what? Lyft, probably, what you'd say. Maybe an old mom and pop cab company, if you know a good one. Yeah. The other thing, one of the remarkable things about New York City is they had this very, well-structured market for taxi cabs, and the taxi cab medallion was a right to run a taxi cab in New York City. And so these taxi cab medallions were kind of like the key money I was talking about. They were worth an extraordinarily large amount of money because it meant that if you had one, you could run a taxi service in Manhattan and in the boroughs if you felt like it. But, wink, wink, the taxi drivers never actually took you to the boroughs if they didn't have to. They would just drive off. So it was mostly in Manhattan, so it was a lucrative thing. And then what happened? Uber and Lyft got introduced, and they are pretty perfect substitutes for taxi cabs. Now, those of you who have taken Uber and Lyft probably will sort of roll your eyes a little bit and say, actually, Lyft is not a perfect substitute for Uber. Do you agree with me? Which do you prefer? Yeah, you prefer Uber, right? And why is that? I don't know, it's just better? Yeah. Yeah, why is it better? And then one could, maybe that's best left unsaid. Why it is that it's better to be in a certain car that hasn't had something happen to it, or whatever it is exactly, I don't know. My partner talks about the air freshener quotient being much higher in Lyft cars for sad reasons. Anyway, so Lyft and Uber are substitutes, and that's the way to think about it. What's a complement? Well, I think the obvious one there is why are you using the Uber? So maybe you're going out for a nice dinner out, and you don't want to have to worry about driving. So the nice dinner would be the complementary good. You enjoy it along with your Uber ride. That's kind of why you want the Uber ride. And so if the price of the complement goes up, you're kind of stuck a little bit. You can't substitute out of a dinner into an Uber or something else. You have to substitute out of a dinner into, like, I don't know, a delivery pizza or something. So that's an example, excuse me, of a complement. So we'll come back to that later. All right, so I wanted to mention this. I thought this was helpful in just assessing what's going on in this part of the class with commodities prices and all that. So when I was an undergraduate, many 300 million years ago, I was reading the equivalent of Econ 1 out of Baumol and Blinder. And so that's gone through, I don't know how many revisions now. Did anybody use that also? No, okay, so that's been deprecated also. Well, so William Baumol was the first author there. The second was this guy named Alan Blinder, who was a vice president of the Fed for a while. And Baumol is most known for coming up with this concept, which is called Baumol's disease, and it refers to the rising relative price of products that could not obviously benefit from technological improvement. And so the classical example, with the pun fully intended, is a Beethoven string quartet. Paying to go see one of these in person is not going to get cheaper over time, because there's no obvious way that technology can improve that. You could think about the phonics within the orchestra hall, I guess, right? I suppose that's subject to some technological change, but how would you think about that? Well, only if you could build a much larger version of Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco. Okay, but would anybody go to that, right? I mean, to some extent, too, then the problem is we get into this problem of how there are luxury goods, like going to see a string quartet, and how you'll pay more for that because it's a luxury good. You'd rather pay more for that than to, pay a couple of bucks, or probably there's no door fee, obviously, for like a high school string quartet or something. So that the two concepts, I guess, might get a little crossed over there. Another great example, though, of the issue about productivity gains and costs is higher education. Ask yourself whether the technologies that we have at our disposal are making this delivery of knowledge and your future benefits in the form of your earnings in the future and your civic engagement and all that, are any of those appreciably better than they were 100 years ago? Maybe, but there are good reasons to think. Certainly not in the sense of other types of goods especially, and even other types of services like maybe legal services, other types of things that can be done more efficiently and obviously well using things like the internet. Has anybody taken an online course before? Oh, many of you have. Maybe a third of you have. Yeah. Any sense about what you felt about that? Did you get everything out of it that you thought you would? So no exuberant shouts of yes. This is a big challenge for higher ed, as to how to think about harnessing productivity gains, or how to think about living in a world where maybe the relative price keeps rising over time because of this problem. Bottom line, you kind of need people talking to people, at least so far, in the technological sort of sets that we seem to have. Okay. Needless to say, there are substitutes to a live string quartet. There are substitutes to there's online learning, for example. And so how to think of this? Well, this is happening to some swath of the economy, but it clearly is the case that when we think about commodities, raw materials, and other inputs, this is just nothing at all like this market for string quartets or this market for higher ed, right? It's very, very different. These are commodities that often we're talking about, ores that are mined out of the ground. But the magical thing, of course, is that it gets very complicated very quickly. You might mine for copper, but the problem is that it shows up as copper dioxide or whatever it is. I'm no expert here. I'm not a miner. But if you go and you do some reading about this sort of thing, what you quickly find is that in addition to this point about new discovery, which is kind of the obvious one, right? So you might find a new copper mine somewhere. Great. Okay. You also might find, however, some way of actually harnessing the usefulness of all that waste that was in the form of copper attached to other atoms, and you had no way of separating the copper out from it all. So there might be these gigantic piles of completely useless dust that sort of has copper in it, but you don't have the technology yet to actually use it. And so that's another big part of it. So you might think about new discoveries that are clearly supply shocks, also including, in addition to finding this new seam of copper or coal or whatever, it might be a new way of extracting the stuff or using what used to be waste. Another thing you could say here is, there might be new downstream technologies that probably would produce some sort of demand shock, increasing the net demand for these sorts of things, or new utilization patterns. And here's the big ugly secret, and I think the big joke, honestly, behind this bet that we'll talk about here in a second between Simon and Ehrlich. A lot of these things are basically controlled by cartels in production. So a big one that many of you may have already thought extensively about, I certainly did at some point in my life, roughly around your age, is there is an extraordinarily powerful diamond cartel that operates, I think, primarily in Africa. I think the Canadians are not part of that cartel. But, diamonds have some street price, and it's controlled by a cartel. The one that's probably more known is OPEC, the oil cartel, that doesn't strictly control, but generally controls the production of oil, how much oil is brought to market. And of course, over the last decade or so, with the advent of what's called fracking, something that does recover some petroleum, but also a lot of natural gas here in the United States, of course, the market has kind of been put on its head. So the thing about commodities is it's a wild, wild west. There's cartels. There's new discoveries and supply shocks. There's all kinds of demand shocks to these commodities also. And if you were to look at something crazy like this ridiculous long time series starting way back in 1861, so we're talking about the start of the Civil War in the United States back here. Apparently, war is not real great for oil prices, right? So 1862 to 1865, if you squint, and I'm sorry for how small that is, but it's the U.S. Civil War massively driving up petroleum prices, and this is the price per barrel. I think it's some measure of... So the good question is kind of how internationalized was the market at this point? It might just be the U.S. price. Because all these, so here's the Suez Crisis, which was a world event. The Suez Crisis was Egypt and the United Kingdom and other great powers kind of getting involved in all this crazy stuff. So we started to see the internationalization of it all. And then all this crazy stuff, too. The global financial crisis bottomed out gas prices and oil prices here after there was a big run-up. So you just see this, right? A lot of stuff happens in commodities markets. But on average, you might suspect that commodities prices might fall over time, maybe. Usage typically goes in one direction. If you use something and it's used up, obviously it's gone, unless you've used it and it's like copper, so it's copper wires. And you can reuse copper wires provided that you can, extract the copper wires again and then melt them down or something like that. Technology also only goes in one direction, though. So if you learn something about how to recover something and recycle it, then you know it, and it's known. And so that only goes in that one direction as well. So there are these countervailing things. If you use something up, obviously that's going to raise the price of it because it reduces the supply. Discoveries of new supply would tend to reduce the price. Developments of new substitutes would tend to reduce the price also. And developments of new uses might raise the price of something, so that's always possible. And the net effect, it's ambiguous. So when Julian Simon made this bet with Paul Ehrlich, and this is kind of the point of the lab, he got really lucky. There's no particular iron law of commodity prices that says they've got to fall forever. The evidence suggests, when sort of thinking about what do prices of various things represent, and underneath it all, why? Sure, maybe they ought to fall if humans are good at coming up with new technologies, but there's no particular iron law here. Just as a side note, so one of my favorite stories was just at the dawn of their getting rich, these family friends of ours were investing in housing, and so they bought a house up in Sacramento, only to find that somebody went in and ripped out all the copper wiring out of their house, and this was back, and I don't want to say like 2009 or 2010, when things were kind of tight and tough for people. And apparently somebody found it useful to go in and break into this house that they had just bought and just rip out all the copper wiring and take it and sell it in the market, apparently. Copper prices go up and down, and that was the other thing. I think presumably at that time, copper was fairly valuable, so it was worth your while to go into somebody's house and rip it out and go sell it. I think we've removed ourselves from that, where it's a little bit easier maybe to get a job these days or something with our sort of tight labor markets. That actually happened, apparently. So before I jump into talking about Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon a little bit more, let me just say a few things. I think there's an easy way of looking at this historical episode with some snark. I like to see jokes and everything, of course, and so I just wanted to say, well, so Simon was right ultimately about this bet. The other thing to say here is that there's a streak in these different schools of thought that would push you to think about something in a particular way. And so economists and biologists are, of course, usually different, although you'll find some overlap there. They tend to bring unique perspectives to things, and economists are sometimes gadflies. And I think all of you know exactly what I mean there. If you've been to a seminar or you're just sort of steeped in the zeitgeist of studying economics, you're sort of like a fly that bites livestock from time to time. You might be one who provokes others into action by criticism. And so there is that there. And when we think about, well, who's ultimately right about this sort of thing? My use of idioms is that the proof is in the pudding, meaning that we have baked our pudding and we don't really know what's going to be happening with things like the climate and sustainability. And the pudding might not be baked yet. So we're going to have to wait to see. But in the short run, there might be certain results, and there was with this bet. The other thing I want to say is that economists tend to hang out around, say, people in business schools, and they tend to hang out with sociologists and with demographers and other people in social sciences. And those are very different groups than biologists and ecologists. One of the magical things about the demography department here at UC Berkeley actually is that it's a coming together of these many groups, that you'll see biologists there. There actually is a biologist, a great one named Jim Carey. That's actually his name, and he's at UC Davis, and he'll come down and he'll talk about his research on fruit flies. And maybe his funny comedic theater, I don't know. But so he comes down and he talks about this, and it makes a lot of sense, but generally speaking, ecologists have a perspective that tends to come out of the natural sciences, where guess what? Human choice is usually not part of the equation. Human choice is a very magical, mysterious thing, and so the soc and econ and demographer side of all that, and the anthropologists and the public policy, and you could just go on and on, are all concerned with this, and the psychologists, right? On the natural side of things, I think the tendency is to draw these takeaways from natural systems that do not involve humans and therefore are not subject to quite the same rules. And it's an open question as to what extent the rules that tend to govern these populations of whether it's fruit flies or some other species like that really translate. Some of them will, some of them won't. So here, if you are interested, there's a URL. We're not going to look at it in class, but so this is a picture of Paul Ehrlich, and it's an interesting takedown. It's kind of a takedown, honestly, when I watched it. So in person, this is what Paul Ehrlich sounds like, and he sort of looks like this also. He sort of sounds a lot like Christopher Lee, which if you've seen any of these movies, I'm not sure about the Dracula one, but these are two favorites of mine. He sort of sounds like like God, basically. He's got this big, deep voice. And what he says in person makes a lot of sense, and it's compelling. In the video clip on YouTube, some of the clips are really not super compelling to me. Especially these days, right, when we're gearing up for the 2020 election, and small clips of things can be very misleading about what people actually have said and mean. I think, to be honest, part of the video clip that turned me off suggested that this was kind of going on. So Paul Ehrlich is really very persuasive in person. And he does a lot of really interesting things, not just lose bets to Julian Simon. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the background here. So there's going to be a bet about prices in commodities markets, but underneath it all, it's this kind of perception. In the 1970s, this was happening, this doubling of the world population from 3 to 6.1 billion over the span of 40 years. So when Paul Ehrlich was writing his books, let me just back up for a second. This is an actual book. It's actually called The Population Bomb, and it was popular. One thing that was really striking to me is if you watch this video, you'll see President Nixon talking about how obviously population is growing too fast and we've got to get it under control. And he's talking about the United States as far as I can tell. It was really weird. There was this tremendous pull of this perspective in the zeitgeist back then. So let's look at this, and this is kind of bracing when you think about it. 1,000 years roughly for a doubling here, from 0 or 1 up to 1,000. 750 years for the next rough doubling up to about just around 1 billion. Another 250 years here. So the time to doubling was just decreasing a lot. And the question is, what is next for doubling time, and just how many people can the Earth actually support? Here now is a forecast from the 2015 UN projection. So there's the UN population division that does this repeatedly. And I've scrunched the slide down a little bit because I want to show you the comparison on the next slide, which is going to be the 2019 forecast. Here's the population in 1950. Here's the number 3, and I put some blue lines to help guide us here. So here's 13 billion up here. So 3 billion around 1960, doubling rather quickly up to about 6.1. And where to next? And so this is the forecast. One thing you might wonder is how often does the forecast change, and has the forecast actually reflected reality particularly well? Then what does this mean? Well, it's a fan that opens up in this time trajectory here, and there's a medium forecast. That's the thick red line. There are, let's see, the dotted ones are a 95% confidence interval, and then there's also an 80% confidence interval, which is when you've derived some kind of sense of the variation in this sort of thing with the underlying mechanisms and all, you'll get some sort of confidence interval about that. So. The belief that, here's our medium guess, and then, reality could be in there somewhere. So here now is the 2019 update. And so if you compare the two, and I've tried to line these up fairly well so we can do this visually. If you compare the two of these, it's only been 4 years, but basically we've tracked along where we thought we would. That's population momentum, which is telling you that even if there's an abrupt change in the rates, like the birth rate or the death rate, you're not going to see any big change in the short run. You're going to pretty much go along the path that you had been going. Here also in the 2019 version of it, we see all these little gray lines, which are the sort of like doll's hair or something like that. It's the suggestion of what these sample trajectories could look like, and they could sort of float around. And here's a darker patch where a bunch of them are overlapping. And then this is kind of interesting. This is plus or minus 0.5 child. Those blue lines, that's kind of the big difference in these two, right? The blue lines are ones that really stand out. So what's the plus or minus 0.5 child? It sounds biblical, right? You're slicing a child in half, I guess, I don't know, and saying, well, plus or minus half a child, there we go, okay, you have that half. It's a remark about this forecast of the total fertility rate, the live births per woman over a lifetime, the estimate of that, and how much higher or lower it could be. And so this really has happened. So here's the world falling from 5 births per woman on average all the way down here to now we're in 2019, 2020, and we're at 2.5. Just a remarkable reduction in that. And so that effectively then kind of is part of the reason why this thing shows, we're still increasing because of population momentum, but then, not a plateauing maybe, but certainly a reduction in the rate of increase in the median forecast. So here, and I regret, in the 2019 forecast, we don't actually see the plus or minus half a child. Do you remember what that was? It's totally biblical, right? It's the king somebody or other who suggested cut the child in half. And then magically, that king managed to make the people see the illogic of their desires. Something like that. It's half a child on either side of this central forecast, which gets to be pretty low. And so the green line is replacement of about 2.1. And we're headed there not too far from now. Okay, so let me show this to you again. That's the forecast of where we might be headed. And I want you to think about the number 12 or 13. And that's, now I want to ask you this. How long will it take the world population to double again? To 12, I probably should have written 13. That's closer, but You could think about dating it from 2000, which would be a little bit more correct. So let's close polling in 3, 2, 1. Close polling. So let's see what people said. Oh, cool. I like that. A uniform distribution of I'm not sure. That's why we're here, right? You're going to tell me, aren't you? Well, I will say that these folks did the reading, and other folks may not have done the reading. So David Lamb says it's 100 years or never. That's E. Why don't we back up and look at that again? Oops, I'll take that histogram off of there. So 12 or 13, let's see, is this right? So 13's up here. So what's the likelihood of reaching 12 or 13? And so this is a 100-year window from the year 2000, which seems, practically ancient, right? We're in the year 2020, the year 2000 seems a long time ago. So David Lamb's feeling is that the UN pop forecasts probably are fairly spot on. And again, it's because of this. It's because of this just remarkable decline in the births per woman, which we really haven't talked a whole lot about, and will more in the second half of the class. So David Lamb's view is probably 100 years or never. I wonder if I'd put the first option at 0 years, if anybody would have chosen that one. That would have been really cool. I don't know exactly how you would get that, right? But it's a hilarious exam question for the solo model where somehow you have 6 billion or 7 billion Martians show up, right? They don't have capital and they are just employed. And so what do? Oh my goodness gracious. Anyway, on and on. Okay. Questions about that before we move on? World population. Okay, what are the stakes? So these are actual quotes from Paul Ehrlich, and the other thing that I think was valuable about the video that has in the URL that's several slides back, if you wanted to take a listen, what's useful there too is that Ehrlich admits that look, I was saying stuff that seems a little over the top, to put it mildly. It's a little bit of an exaggeration to say these things. More frequent droughts, more damaged crops and famines, extreme unpleasantness, but I guess in a sense it's so eerie like sewage swimming. More sewage swimming. I can't wait for that. That's in spring break, right? We're going to go sewage swimming. So, the language here is a bit on the alarmist side. End of civilization. I think there's something about crime in here, right? More drugs, more crime. Oh, yes, we hate those. So, more gridlock. I definitely don't like that. That's true. More epidemics. Okay, so, yeah. The thing is that, sometimes, especially to sell a book, you might say something. We're all thinking about that with Ambassador Bolton these days, right? What is he going to say in that book, which he's refusing to talk about? You also might say something if you just really think you need to persuade somebody to do something. And the other sort of genre in which you'll find this kind of thing frequently is actually in the business of retirement planning. That sometimes folks will say rather outrageous claims regarding your expected longevity in order to get you to save more money with their company. And so that's a kind of a parallel here. So, he's kind of upfront about it. It should be taken with a grain of salt. But he still had a point. So Julian Simon sort of took this opposite caricatured view of things. He was an affiliate of the Cato Institute, and the Cato Institute has long been known for being kind of a free libertarian sort of thing in Washington. He was at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and then at Maryland. And so David Lamb he was also an economist and a very smart one, a wonderful person. David Lamb is just great, and described him as often coming to the Population Association of America meetings in the 1980s. And he was a pot stirrer, right? He liked to be a gadfly and say provocative things, and it was on this other side of things. And Lamb's sense there is that they had a substantial impact on the population resource debate. And the argument is that if humans are thrifty and crafty in a way that typically fruit flies and other creatures usually aren't, then the real prices of commodities ought to be declining as technology reveals more supplies and substitutes for these sorts of things. The alternative is this crazy dystopia of exhausting resources along the way to oblivion. When you say it like that, it's obviously rather clear. It's hard to even think that, the part of the other argument is right. But as we'll see next time, the thing about global warming is that we're in big trouble with that. Why? Well, prices are meaningful if free markets and property rights are well defined. Historically, commodity markets, of course, were often run by production cartels, and so that's one big asterisk there. And in our new economy, we don't really know that much about whether demand cartels might also be important for things like depressing prices of. I think about cardboard all the time personally as a with a household unit. I mean, I love how I don't have to actually go to Target. I can just order everything on Amazon, but it shows up in these boxes, right? And well, you can recycle cardboard. Can you really? I mean, what's the energy loss along the way there? And is it really worth doing that rather than just going to Target, but you have to drive to Target? And there are all these things. But what I wonder about is, well, to what extent is Amazon actually passing on the true costs of these things versus absorbing the costs because they want your money and they want to drive everybody else out of business? That's the way the cartels work. So it's not really all that obvious. And a much bigger problem, so this is the thing about global warming especially, when property rights are poorly defined with temperature and global atmosphere. The sad reality here is that, especially with temperature mattering for sea levels, the people whose property are clearly most affected by this are going to be those in island nations where sea level rises are really big things, right? It's not us. It's not people in North America. It's people in the Pacific. So their property matters a lot, and the problem is that we've not figured out a real good way of sort of syncing all that. So we'll talk about that more next time. Let's talk about the bet, the Ehrlich and Simon bet. And so this actually happened. And the way that they did this might give you a little bit of pause, is to think about the inflation-adjusted price. So in the 1980 price in 1990, that's what this means. You're adjusting the price of chrome in 1990 for the general rise in consumer prices between these two periods of time, which again tends to be a number like 2% in the modern era, but probably was a little different back during this period because if you remember your macroeconomics, this was the period of Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and Paul Volcker, who recently died, and the great increase in inflation and then interest rates to get it under control. So that probably was sort of interesting in the midst of all this. All of these saw reductions in price, and so if you like to search the internet for these sorts of things, like I was doing to prepare the slides, you'll see these funny stories about the cartels with these, and what was happening with the prices, and how Julian Simon kind of got really lucky, honestly, with his timing of all this. So he won the bet, and Paul Ehrlich and his colleagues wrote Julian Simon a check then for the difference, basically. Okay, so in the lab, you get to have some hands-on with the data and to look at the story if there had been a bet at a different time, and looking at commodities that may have gone up in price. Maybe. So they do all the time, right? There are a lot of commodities that go up and down. Okay, so there are exhaustible resources, there are renewable resources, and sustainability is an important issue here. So here's I'm sorry, that's other S word. Substitutability is important. Is there a substitute for the thing that you're using? So a case study that is kind of fun to think about, especially if you've ever been to the East Coast. Here, the whaling story never really was a big issue on the California coast. What is true, and I'll advertise this to you, although I think we're too late now. I think we've missed the northern migration, but the California gray whales migrate along the coast, and you can go see them. You just have to leave Berkeley and catch your Uber and go over to Marin County or San Francisco and see the whales. And so that's pretty cool. You get to see them, but I think they've already completed, or at least are midstream in their northern migration. So they come all the way down from Alaska and they go all the way back up. And so the times that you want to go do that are usually in January, I think. On the East Coast, whales and hunting whales was a really big deal, and it was a really big, ecological deal. Taking these big mammals out of the food chain and hunting, especially the New England right whale, practically out of existence. So they still exist. If you go whale watching out there, and if they see a right whale, there are these strict rules about how you got to keep your distance from those guys because they're endangered still. There are not very many of them around. So a story then with whale oil was, well, why hunt these creatures anyway? And it turned out a big part of it was to boil their bodies down and get whale oil out of it, and that would then fuel lamps. But as whale harvesting commenced, then it would be harder to get whales, and the other thing that you're leaving yourself exposed to is the destruction of the ships, whether the whale rams it or the weather is bad or something like that. And so it's not exactly the safest thing you can do. And so the other developments that happened that ultimately helped spell the end of whaling, which, of course, there are these international agreements now to do it, but markets helped produce these substitutes for whale oil in light. And then that was eventually good for whales and humans. The humans got their light in the short run from harvesting whales, which, of course, was not very good for the whales. So if you look at the historical pattern of the price of lumen hours, so the amount that you would pay in British pounds for 1 million lumen hours, which is of course kind of a lot, it was extremely high back in this era of the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and all that, and then it really fell off a cliff here after 1800. With some of the development of other petroleums, and then finally electrification really ran the thing into the ground. Very good for whales, and of course, not bad for people. Honestly, that's one thing I do think about, right? So with the whole cost disease, right, with higher education, well, many years ago, you would be in a lecture hall this size, but with no electrification. So heaven help you if you could actually see anything like the board or any of that, right? It would all just be candles. And somehow we made our way out of that era. Questions? Let's do this. Here's another iClicker question. And so I thought this was relevant and useful to introduce at this point. I've got an axis, and there's one good x1 along the horizontal and another good x2 along the vertical. And I'm saying that our production of some output good y is a function of x1 and x2. And the isoquants tell me how much I'm producing. So along this isoquant, I'm producing 1 unit. Here I'm producing 2. Here I'm producing 3. So fairly familiar if you've taken micro before. And so the question is this a picture of substitutes, complements, or impossible to tell? X1 and x2. So discussion is good. Okay, so why don't we close polling in 3, 2, 1, then we'll discuss. So I think the best answer is A. Good, okay. Let's see. So most people said A, that's great. The visual patterns here are that these are isoquants that don't have a lot of curvature to them. They're pretty straight, but not completely straight. So there is some substitution, but it's not a perfect substitute kind of story. And in your mind's eye, you might think about a linear budget constraint that's telling you the different amounts, the different bundles of X1 and X2 you can buy for a particular amount of cash. That's going to have some slope. And if there's a change in the relative price of X1 and X2, that's going to change the slope. And a very small change in that relative price would result in a very big change in the optimal choice of X1 versus X2. That's because they're substitutes. If they're very similar, then you'll just take the cheaper one. So you could think of Lyft and Uber being these two goods. Here's Lyft, I guess, and here's Uber. I don't know. Then we have to make it more complicated, right? Because we all prefer Uber for some reason. In terms of the corporate sort of, I don't know, history, I guess, corporate personality, I think Lyft is the better of the two. Okay, so let's now look at these. If these are the isoquants in production, then good X1 and good X2 are what? Okay, so let's close polling in 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Okay, so the best answer is B. These are complements. These two questions, of course, are also complements. And so B is the right answer. Those are complements. And okay, got to get that guy off of there. All right. So complements. The story there is that you kind of need to have both of these things together, and even if you saw a decent change in the price of one of them, chances are you might not actually change your bundle. So in the back of your mind, think of a budget constraint that kind of looks like that. There's not much of a change in the slope of this thing that's going to move you much off of, you might think of this as sort of the income expansion path, as the choices that you make are kind of fixed really in proportions. And so this would be a story of your use of Uber versus your whatever you use Uber for, like the going out to a nice dinner or something like that, or getting to school on time or something. Questions about that? Complements and substitutes. So we'll do the visual thing here too. There's of course a mathier definition of it that you may have seen in 100A or 101A, the math version of that or something that maybe we'll delve into, but basically this is the story. Visually it's useful to think about what these look like. I've couched all this, of course, in terms of production, right? So these are isoquants. It's the number of things that you can produce using these goods. The other analog, obviously, is consumer choice. So both of these could have instead been indifference curves, sets of indifference curves. So there's a lot of substitutability between these goods in terms of your preferences. You're just as well off if you take one or the other. And here's the story about complements. And I guess, come to think of it, I should have been talking about substitutes in production, and I can't even think of what that would be. Uber and Lyft are clearly substitutes in terms of your preferences. All right, so back to the bet. What was happening at the time, in the run-up to the bet, which of course started in 1980, and so Ehrlich and Simon were going back and forth, and so here's kind of this other point, that commodities markets are doing all kinds of things, and in the time where Ehrlich was writing his books and all that, here are these big jumps in prices of food, and so he wasn't unaware of this, and so that's the motivation for the title. So maybe Paul Ehrlich was an empiricist, and I think the answer is yes. People had their eyes open about what was happening in markets. The other thing in the 1970s, as we saw back here on the gas and the price of oil plot way back somewhere, is this big crazy run up here that didn't stop, right? So this was the beginning of an embargo here in the Yom Kippur War, following that with the reaction by OPEC. Here's a story about Iran cutting production. So this didn't end, not for a long, long time, not until we get up to about 1987 or so. So that's kind of the story there. Paul Ehrlich was aware of this. Let's talk about, sorry, I've gotten all the way back here. Okay. All right. There's a tragedy of the commons story that's going to be coming up here that comes along with the property rights deal. There's a challenge when things are public goods in some sense. So if you're talking about things that have these things that are not excludable, was one of the big problems, and here's the other real story that, underneath it all, the story about choice is all well and good if you have the means to actually make the choice, and I think that's why this is up there. There are a bunch of market failures, and so one might say, well, we're not convinced that, in fact, markets are really going to be driving us in the right direction the whole way. So if markets are functioning, then perhaps increasing population won't actually lead us into disaster, but adaptation instead. And so that's a quote from David Lamb. When there are problems with markets, or when poverty inhibits the operation of market forces, this is a quote from McKellar and Horlacher, which was on the reading list 20 years ago. Population size and the rate of growth usually magnify the adverse impact on natural resources and the environment. So, markets are great. They are going to help move us in the direction that incentives hopefully would push us, which is toward innovation, ways of doing more with less or with what we have. So here's a quote from Sam Preston, who is also an economist, although he's on faculty emeritus now in a sociology department. And what he pointed out was that, well, if you look at the empirical record, it's a time over the last 50 or 70 years or so when there was accelerated economic growth and population growth appeared also to happen concomitantly. So apparently it's not an overwhelming negative factor, at least in history. And that suggests maybe to be a bit optimistic as we go forward, but of course cautious if we think about the future not being exactly as the past was. And I think with climate change, that's kind of the problem, that it's not at all obvious that the future will be like the past. So David Lamb produces some really nifty graphs that we can have a look at here, looking at the last 50 years and these different measures of human well-being, poverty rates, renewable resources like food and also metals. Here's estimates of the poverty rates for different world regions. So the total world is the dark lines here, the dark circles, and that's downward from a rather poverty, rather high rate here. And so I think we must be conditioning on low and middle income countries. So we're not counting the United States in here, but that should be a bit distressing, a 50% rate of poverty. But still, we've seen reductions. Somewhat less of a success story in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, there's a reason then why, for example, the Nobel Prize this past year went to researchers who were doing work in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, because the need there still remains pretty great. This was a rather remarkable graph, and that is if you look at the change in population and the change in food production then since 1960, and thus the per capita food production, so that's the bottom line. Population is right here. This is food production, and per capita food production is down here. A pretty impressive trend, especially over the last, say, 20 years, since 2000, I'd say. Enough so that sub-Saharan Africa, which unfortunately has been the basket case, was not so, what you can say is that if there's a surplus in these other areas, then unfortunately the deficit here with the reduction in the per capita food production in sub-Saharan Africa at least could maybe be made up with foreign aid or on international markets. The irony, and so this is the wild thing that Josh Goldstein added for the slides here, was that David Lamb was writing right around the end of this time. And so he was looking at a period of time when the food prices were actually spiking here. And one wonders, given this optimistic view that he had at that point, would he have been borne out in the future? And so this is what Professor Goldstein added, and the answer was sort of yes. Another example of commodity prices kind of doing their own thing, coming back down again in the years after the publication of this study by David Lamb. So prices jump around a ton. There's no particular rule that says they got to move in one direction or the other, but there certainly are reasons to think that commodity prices are not going to be rising forever. And I think that was maybe shocking at the time when an economist said that to an ecologist who felt like population was increasing far too rapidly and therefore we'd be using up all of our resources. But, and here's another quote from Paul Ehrlich, which didn't make it into the slides, but Ehrlich says, well, I think what I should have probably done is taking a bet about the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And he probably would have won that had he made the bet about carbon dioxide. Things that have markets are one story. Things that don't, like the atmosphere, kind of a different story. So the past looks not bad. The future, that's a little bit less obvious. And now finally, let me make this point about risk aversion. And this is, I think, quite salient. We'll talk about global warming next time. What do we do now when the future is unknown? We think some things might look like the past, but there are also a lot of processes that we still don't really understand a ton about. We're going to talk about William Nordhaus's share of the 2018 Nobel Prize. So William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize, half of it for his work on climate change, and it's just impressive what he was able to do with an empirical, calibrated model of everything with global warming. Economies, the biology of it all, with I think the geophysics of it, the climate science, all of it goes into this model that he built. And that was a large reason why he won the Nobel. But the thing is that even when you have a really great model, and it's calibrated based on the centuries of data that we have out of climate measurements and carbon dioxide amounts that we've seen that's frozen in glaciers and things like that. So there are measures of what these things were years ago, but there's still great uncertainty about how the globe actually functions as a system, and we have never actually put it through this test that we're currently doing with carbon dioxide emissions. So you can win the Nobel Prize with this amazing body of research, and absolutely this person should have. But there's still so much lingering uncertainty about what the future will actually hold, and then this point becomes very salient. Do we have risk aversion over what's going to happen in the distant future? If change is basically for the better, maybe we don't need to be afraid. But if we don't really know exactly what's going to pop out of the future path of the Earth, and if we are averse to risk, maybe we should be careful, even if we're not really strict about conserving things. And so I think this quote at the bottom must have come from Professor Goldstein about how fast should we drive in the dark, is this metaphor. And the answer is not real fast, right? So if you've got thick fog, you don't drive fast, even if you have an estimate about where the road leads. And you have an estimate about the cars in front of you because you've seen them go past. But all these things are just estimates, right? There's no guarantee that there isn't a stopped car in front of you in the fog. And if it's in the dark, same story. So that's the point. If there's risk aversion, maybe we should take a somewhat different course because we're totally unclear about what's going to come. Okay, so that's all I've got today on that topic. Now, the next one will be thinking about the Malthusian model with sustainability and renewable resources. So before we start that, are there questions? What are the big takeaways? Is that useful to talk about? So prices ought to reflect scarcity of resources. Productivity and technological change impacts that by bringing substitutes to markets for scarce resources. When property rights are well defined, things like that work well. When they are not, or when there are other market imperfections, like there's a cartel, it's the wild, wild west. You have no idea what's going to happen. That's when you go to your experts at Forbes, I guess, who research it. Yes? The prices reflect scarcity, the question goes, but how are externalities are counted for? And the answer is they're not, generally not. So what's an externality? It's things like pollution. I guess that's the best example, right? The quality of the air, of the water, of maybe the sound and other types of things. You could think about light pollution or something. They're usually not in just a standard market situation if there is an externality. there usually has to be a government that says, we've got an issue where there's an externality. And if you like, it's enforcing a property right, but usually private markets don't actually do that sort of thing. Other questions? Isn't it remarkable, so just stepping back, that in the past, fire departments were actually privately run? Like people got it together and realized this is something with an externality, right? If my neighbor's house catches on fire, my house might catch on fire. And we need to have some way of addressing this issue by having a fire department. In the early stages of this republic, we didn't have governments that did a whole ton of things, and so it was done privately at that point. So there are cases in which markets can actually arise if people have enough foresight. I think the big problem that we're facing here is that, especially with climate change, we're talking about many, many, many years and decades and centuries, and I don't know who has the time horizon to think about that. I don't have time to think about my time horizon most of the time, right? But then you combine that with how it appears like all of our policymakers are all 80 years old, right? Like all of the presidential candidates are all 80 except for Buttigieg, and Klobuchar's like 60, I guess. If you have policymakers who are all 80 years old, what's their time horizon going to be? What's your time horizon? Probably a good 60 years. Are you thinking about your children too? Are we all thinking about our children as we should be with this sort of thing? And we'll talk more about that next time. It's kind of the crux of the matter. How much do you weight future developments the same as the developments today, or do you discount them a little bit, like economic theory suggests maybe you should, but then how much do you discount them, at what rate? Okay. Sustainability and renewable resources. So fisheries, forest, aquifers, clean water, atmosphere. And these resources, like other capital yield a flow of services. And so in the example that we've got that we'll work through, it's going to be stocks of fish, and thinking about the sustainability of a particular harvest or amount of fishing that gets done. And these are renewable things, so the fish, new fish are born because the fish spawn and all that good stuff. It's not like finite resources like copper, that if you have just one earth, it's pretty clear that there's some amount that's ever obtainable, and you can't go beyond that unless somehow you, find it on a different planet or something like that. Okay, so the point is going to be this, that sustainability happens if you've got a renewal rate that is greater than or equal to the rate of loss for something like fish or timber or fresh water. And so we're going to have these familiar things from the Malthus model, a birth rate, a fraction of resources that becomes newly available each year, which is a function of the stock of it usually, or it could be some other natural function. A death rate, a fraction that is lost without harvest, and then there's going to be some harvest rate that ends up over here as sort of the net reduction in the stock that's there. Part of the losses that happen. And we'll have sustainability using this Malthusian model that's adapted with this extra harvesting parameter. There's going to be a proportion H out of the stock of these fish that are floating around that get harvested. So that's the harvesting rate. And the total harvest then is the total number of fish who are fished and removed and eaten or something, or they're, put up on trophy walls or whatever. And the questions we would like to answer then, what happens to the population over time, the stock of fish, if you have a particular harvest rate, if you change this harvest rate? What happens to the net take, capital H, uppercase H, if we change little h, the harvest rate? What is non-sustainability, and will markets optimize the harvest? And so this is kind of the hardest one. And just sitting aside, so does anybody come from a family of fisher people? Does anybody? It's kind of like farming. There are very few of us who have any direct connection to farming or fishing. And of course, it turns out if you look at sectoral sort of agglomerations, fishing is part of all this. Fishing, forestry, agriculture, they're all measured kind of in the same part of the industry measures. They're also lumped together. So if you look at the story with fishing, and of course, if you are a private fisher person and you go get a fishing license, say from the state, it's got some limits on season and often a limit on how many fish you can take. And that's exactly what happens for commercial fishing as well. So there are limits here that are imposed. And so it's sort of a tough question to ask. Will markets optimize uppercase H? Well, what does that really mean? Is a government saying you can only take a certain amount of fish? Is that a market solution? I think we would tend to say probably not. It's a voting kind of thing. And that's the way that fishing actually gets done, right? There are limits on the amount that people can fish. If you think about the competition between different countries, of course, that gets a little bit more interesting because different countries do fish the same international waters sometimes. And how does that all get worked out? And it's usually done through some kind of treaty. And you'll see all kinds of backs and forths about it between these countries that compete for the same area. All right, so the same picture basically where we've just reimagined what some of these things are. So there's a food per fish that's going to be important to actually sustain these fish. So the more food they get, the more they are able to spawn. The less food they get, the more they might starve and drop off, just like a wage for people sort of works like this. There's a fish population which you could think of being like over a certain area or a density of fish. And then there are these events. So the births and the deaths, just like before. And the story is that this harvest rate bumps up the death curve effectively. And the question is this going to be a sustainable kind of thing? The way we've drawn it, yes, at this particular rate of harvest, little h. And the questions that we might have are, well, what's our optimal little h if we want to make as much money as possible and bring as many fish in? And all that. You have to assume that there's some plateauing here of the birth curve if you want there to be some sustainability threshold. So what we've drawn here, suppose you've got this death curve plus a harvest rate, and the harvest rate is so darn big that it's just above this birth curve, and so that's going to be problematic. That's going to lead to a cataclysmic reduction. You've always got the net takings exceeding the new fish, and you'll always just see us, moving this way down. So those fish get a lot of food per fish, but unfortunately it doesn't help them enough. They're never able to recover, and they will just go all the way down to minuscule amounts. So that's going to be the story. In choosing the harvest rate, it seems clear that there's got to be some kind of maximum, because if on the one hand, if the harvest rate is 0, then we also get nobody, we don't get any fish. So the total take is 0. And if we harvest way too much, then we also get 0. We drive everything to extinction. So there's got to be some kind of in-between rate, this little h, that actually gives us some special setup where we've maximized the amount of the taking. So here's a story. It's you could think of it as a Laffer curve or a Kuznets curve or something. There's got to be some rate that we've pushed the thing to extinction, the fish to extinction. There's got to be also this point 0 where we connect over here on the left-hand side. And so the question then is going to be, there's an optimal rate. How do we find that, and what's the mechanism that gets us there? And if we just kind of let the wild, wild west happen and fisher people can go out and catch as many fish as they want, would we actually end up at that optimal rate? So there's a really nifty little app that we can look at, and you can look at if you like before class next time. We'll take this up again next time. It gets us to this question of, there's a tragedy of the commons, a public good out there, the fish. And the problem is if some folks overfish, that reduces us, pushing us sort of further this away, right? But it's individually optimal. So we'll talk more about that next time, and will then also lead us eventually toward age structure the next week. Thank you.